Hey, no judging. It was a really bad election night. My name is Brian Trippett. I am your front porch conservative. Step on up to my electronic front porch and let's talk. No, don't worry, folks. I didn't drink it all. And for that matter, I didn't drink any of it. I'm not wasting good whiskey on these two loser elections. There's no way of getting around it. Let's just be honest. There is no amount of lipstick you can put on this pig to make it any more attractive. Tuesday night's election results in Chicago and in Wisconsin are pigs. For conservatives and populists, these are very disappointing results. In Chicago, Brandon Johnson, Cook County Supervisor, defeated former Chicago school CEO Paul Vallis by a fraction. But Johnson's election ensures that the policies of Lori Lightfoot and the progressive left will continue to go on in Chicago. In Wisconsin, Judge Janet Prasewicz defeated former state Supreme Court Justice Daniel Kelly, and not only defeated him, she basically held him by the nose and kicked him in the rear end up and down the state of Wisconsin. Anyway, it was a bad night. But we'll get into the results, we'll get into some analysis of what happened, and we'll try and figure out what's going to happen going forward and what the implications are in both of these races. Hang on. We'll start looking at all that in just a second. We're going to begin our discussion and analysis with the race in Chicago, Illinois for the mayor's office. This was very high profile, an off year election, big implications. You had two different wings of the Democratic Party squaring off in the Windy City. And I tell you what, the results surprised me, but they didn't surprise me either. They do make me sad. Now, you may remember that I did a video about this maybe about a week or so ago discussing the two candidates, Cook County Supervisor Brandon Johnson, who inevitably won this race, and his challenger, former Chicago school CEO Paul Vallis. I thought that Vallis was the better candidate as far as his solutions for the problems in Chicago, and I was waiting to see if voters had finally had enough of progressive Democratic politics that they'd be willing to make a change. And throughout most of the night, Vallis held a lead, but in the end, the results didn't hold up. So let's go ahead and get into it. The results, at least with 92% in, and this is more or less when they called the race, Brandon Johnson had 287,000 votes, and Paul Vallis had a little over 271,000. That's a difference of almost 3%. And I will point out one statistically interesting thing. That's just a little over 550,000 votes. The population of Chicago is over 3.6 million. Basically, 15% of the population in Chicago decided this election. No, that's not even fair. The difference in the vote tally between these two is just a touch over 16,000. Basically, 16,000 people decided the direction that Chicago was going to go. Anytime that anybody tells you your vote doesn't matter, tell them to cram it. It's elections like this that prove that every individual vote is important. I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe everybody needs to be educated, everybody needs to go out and vote. So 15% of the population voted in total, and 16,000 people in the end gave the difference and the direction for which Chicago is going to go for the next 4 years. Just let that marinate in your brain for a little bit. Now, as far as what happened exactly, I'm going to take you now to an article from Vox.com. This one I thought was fairly interesting. Written by Christian Paz, used to write over at The Atlantic. The big upset in the Chicago mayor's race explained. Despite concerns about crime in Chicago, progressive Brandon Johnson beat moderate Paul Vallis. There's one part of this article in particular I want to go to, and it's a discussion about the various factions inside the Democratic Party in Chicago and how they lined up on this. So Give me just a moment and we will get to that section. I thought this was really interesting. Yeah, here we go. Vallis and Johnson represent different visions for Democrat politics. Vallis and Johnson are nearly perfect contrast of Democrat candidates and their bases of support. Though Vallis was long expected to emerge from the first round of voting near the top of the pack, and you got to remember, this election on April the 4th was a runoff. There was an election held earlier, back in February, and that was the one that in the end, no candidate received above 50%. It goes to the runoff. Brandon Johnson did not have a lot of name recognition throughout the first wave of campaigning. Johnson's second-place finish was the culmination of a late burst of support that coincided with the slow slide in the polls of U.S. Representative Jesus Chuy Garcia, the one-time frontrunner, and the gradual consolidation of progressive support around Johnson. Now, here's where it gets into the discussion of the factions inside Democratic politics in Chicago. Within the city, various centers of power had been jockeying over influencing and reaching voters. The Chicago Teachers Union had been working hard to convince voters of Vallis's controversial past as the former CEO of the Chicago public school system and to boost Johnson's credentials as a solid progressive Democrat. Though still an underdog, Johnson gained the backing of both traditional bastions of liberal support, such as the CTU and an array of SEIU-affiliated unions, national progressive groups like Our Revolution and Working Families Party, which have invested time in rallying supporters, door-knocking, and informing voters about their options. Boosting Vallis had been the Fraternal Order of Police, the union that represented the majority of Chicago's police officers. Often called controversial, the union also wielded significant influence in Chicago politics and lent legitimacy to Vallis's broader campaign focus of centering public safety. Vallis tried hard to contrast his vision of policing with Johnson's by promising to fill vacancies in the police force, deploying police to the city's public transportation network, and increasing funding for the police department. That last plank of his message was also meant to contrast with Johnson's previous support for calls to, quote, defund the police in the wake of the police killings of George Floyd in 2020. Johnson now opposes cuts to police budgets. Sorry, folks, I got a little choked up on that one. Don't know why. And has emphasized his goal of hiring 200 new detectives to focus on solving and deterring crime. Well, that's just great, because right now you've got about, last I heard, they were down 1,700 officers in the Chicago PD. So I don't know how that 200 new detectives is really going to do a lot for you there, Brandon Johnson. Both the Fraternal Order Police and the Chicago Teachers Union frequently clashed with Lori Lightfoot. The CTU went on strike while negotiating a new contract with the city, while the FOP resisted coronavirus vaccine mandates and criticized Lightfoot's police reform attempts and crime prevention policies. Vallis had also been supported by some of the city's biggest businesses and corporate leaders who funded the bulk of his financial war chest. Vallis raised more than $19 million, about $8 million more than Johnson has raised, and outspent Johnson nearly 2-to-1 margin on television ads. Now, you listen to numbers like that when it comes to the finances of these campaigns, and you start to ask yourself, well, how is it that Vallis lost? But you got to remember who Brandon Johnson was backed by. The Chicago Teachers Union and a bunch of SEIU unions. Let me tell you something. If you don't know anything about Democrat politics, or particularly Chicago Democrat politics, the Teachers Union in Chicago is one of the most powerful grassroots forces in the entire Windy City. They will knock on doors, they'll pass out flyers, they'll get on phones and call people, they'll do all the grassroots legwork, to make your campaign hum. And even though Brandon Johnson was outspent by Paul Vallis, that legwork and manpower in the end and the get out the vote effort that the unions can do benefited Johnson. He barely, and I mean barely, aced Vallis. 16,000 votes is not a huge margin in one sense. It's like I said, you run the numbers on that race, it's like 2.8, 2.9%. But it was just enough. Just enough to keep progressive politics in the mayor's office. Now, what's the immediate impact? Well, here's something for you to think about. The next article we're going to look at comes from a organization called Wire Points. They are in Illinois. They focus on city and state politics, and they've got a response article to the election from Tuesday night, written by Ted Dabrowski and John Klingler. Chicagoans cheered Mayor Lightfoot's exit. Gone was her toxic attitude, her flippant dismissal of the city's many crises, her dismal record on crime, and her destruction of police morale. She was an absolute failure by any measure. So Chicagoans kicked out Lightfoot. Change was possible. But what Chicagoans voted for on April 4th was someone more extreme and exact opposite of what the city needs. To reduce Chicago's nationwide homicide rate, Chicago needed a new mayor willing to take on Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx's unwillingness to prosecute dangerous criminals, a mayor willing to challenge Judge Tim Evans' decarcerationist agenda, a mayor willing to jam shut the system's revolving door for criminals. Mayor-elect Brandon Johnson won't do any of that. Instead, look to him to embrace the policies of Fox and Evans. In his own words, he's for defunding the police and defends looting as, quote, now catch this, an outbreak of incredible frustration and anguish tied to a failed racist system. In other words, the resulting crime in Chicago is caused by race. Oh, good God. Reading a little further, and as for the city's economic climate and business friendliness, Chicago needed a mayor who would make the city affordable again by growing the tax base, not the tax rate, who would encourage companies to come to the city, not lambast them as the cause of social ills. Johnson will do the opposite. He promised to target businesses and the wealthy to pay for his social programming. We've already seen leaders in business and finance like Ken Griffin and Citadel and Boeing leave. Don't be surprised to see a continued steady outflow. The damage could be deep. The silver lining in all this? A few years under Johnson may finally push the center-left in Chicago to finally give a reformer the support of 50% plus one. And frankly, I was hoping that would happen right now. The question is, how bad of a hit will Chicago have taken during that time? To its safety, to its social cohesion, to its finances, to its population, to its economic base? Will it be fixable, especially with all its debts? Great questions. Like I said, I'm not going to lie. I was hoping that the Chicago mayor's race would begin to turn the city around. I don't think that Paul Vallas was the be-all and end-all or the one-man answer. I don't like putting that kind of pressure on one politician, regardless of who they are, what party they're in, or what office they're elected to. No one person does everything by themselves. Now, one person can have a profound impact, but it's not a one-man show, particularly in municipal government. Vallas would have started the process of turning Chicago in the right direction. Tragically, he won't get that opportunity. Right now, you're about to see Lori Lightfoot on steroids. If you thought she was bad, wait till you get a load of this guy. All right, so let's take a look at the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. This one, you could make an argument, is more painful than the Chicago mayor's race for a lot of different reasons, and I think you'll begin to see what I'm talking about when we start digging into this. Before we do, I have to give a hat tip right now to Rich Barris, a.k.a. the People's Pundit. He did a wonderful video on this today, talking about the differences in the numbers. If you don't know anything about him, Barris is a pollster, and this is what he does. He analyzes and crunches numbers. So some of this is borrowed from his presentation, so I wanted to be fair up front and just let you know that, and I also want to be fair to him by acknowledging his work on this. So Rich, much thanks, sir. I genuinely appreciate it, and thank you for the work you did, and thank you for pointing me to some of this stuff so I can share it with my audience. So let's go ahead and get into it. Before we do, I want to set this up contextually to give you an idea of what happened to Daniel Kelly against his opponent, Janet Prasewicz. Take a look at this. This goes back to 2016. This is the result of the presidential election in Wisconsin. Now, you'll remember it was very close, and for the first time since 1984, a Republican took Wisconsin. Now, Donald Trump did it by roughly 23,000 votes. He barely aced out Hillary Clinton, with a little help from Libertarian Gary Johnson. But you notice tight election, a Republican can win the state. Now, 2020, although I don't have the numbers up for it, the total vote was about 3.2 million. This is about 2.9 if you add everything up. So with 2020, there's a profound interest in that race. Difference of about 300,000 between 2016 and 2020. So a Republican can win statewide in Wisconsin. Now, let me show you another graph. This is the 2022 Senate race between incumbent Republican Ron Johnson and his challenger, Democrat Mandela Barnes. Again, a very close race. Johnson wins by about 26,000 votes. Total cast is about 2.6 million, which, by the way, for an off year, for a non-presidential election year, that's pretty good. Because, I mean, you think back to 2016, they had 2.9 million. 2020, they had 3.2. That's darn close to presidential election year turnout, but that's an off-year election. But again, a Republican can win statewide. Look at how all the votes lay out. Now, you're thinking to yourself, okay, Trump carried Wisconsin. You know, Ron Johnson carried Wisconsin. So what happened? So surely Daniel Kelly can do the same thing. Wrong answer. Janet Prasewicz beat him by over 200,000 votes. Basically an 11-point win by the time everything was tallied out. This was a butt-kicking of just epic proportions. This is just bad all the way around. There's no way of getting around it. I mean, Kelly was... We'll get into the reasons why momentarily, but now the upshot of all this... What was a 4-3 conservative majority on the court has now gone to a 4-3 liberal majority on the court with Janet Prasewicz's election. And if you're already thinking what I think you're thinking, then you know exactly what I'm thinking. It ain't good for a lot of reasons, because it's April of 2023, and the next election that comes around is, that's right, November 5th, 2024, presidential election. You don't think that certain things that are brought before the state Supreme Court aren't going to affect the race for president in 2024? You're crazy. Now, as to what exactly happened to Kelly, there's a lot of things could be said as to why he got his butt kicked. I will start out with something that is humorous, and it kind of has it's not said well, to be perfectly honest, but if you start digging underneath the statement, you begin to understand what is trying to be said. I want to take you to an article right now written by John Solomon over at Just the News. This is kind of interesting. No, I'm sorry, it was Charlotte Hazard. I stand corrected. And take a look at this. Donald Trump says Dan Kelly lost Wisconsin Supreme Court race because he didn't seek an endorsement. Now, you know, say what you want to about Trump, but he is never lacking for chutzpah. Let's get into this, because it's funny. I know what Trump's trying to say, and I'm not trying to be unkind to him, so please don't misunderstand me. But the way this comes across just has so much bravado to it. You just kind of roll your eyes and go, oh my God. Anyway, let's get into this. Former President Donald Trump blames the Wisconsin Supreme Court majority, going to the Democrats for the first time in years, on conservative candidate Dan Kelly's decision not to seek a Trump endorsement. Quote, Dan Kelly of Wisconsin just lost his Supreme Court election, Trump wrote on Truth Social. He bragged that he won't seek Trump's endorsement, so I didn't give it, which guaranteed his loss. How foolish is a man that doesn't seek an endorsement that would have won him the election? Now, like I said, you gotta love Trump for moments just like that, because they're like, well, you know, he didn't seek my endorsement, that's why I lost. Okay, let's parse that down a little bit, shall we? Taking away Trump's bravado, he does make a valid point. Daniel Kelly didn't want anything to do with Donald Trump. I mean, everybody right now is talking about, oh, abortion, abortion, abortion. That's what decided the Wisconsin state Supreme Court race. You know, and I'm not saying abortion wasn't a factor. I mean, there's a very old ban that goes back to the 19th century on abortions that is going to come up before the state Supreme Court. But, you know, Ron Johnson is a pro-life U.S. senator. He won in Wisconsin. In 2016, Donald Trump won in Wisconsin. He's pro-life. You know, yes, he lost in 2020 to Joe Biden, but barely, and I mean just barely. So a pro-life candidate can win statewide in Wisconsin. Scott Walker did it for years. He was the governor out there. So when Trump says, you know, Daniel Kelly didn't seek the endorsement, what does that mean exactly? Well, what it gets down to is if Trump had given his endorsement or Kelly had sought it, asked for it, they talk it out, whatever, would it have brought out the Trump base? Well, here's something for you to think about. Remember what Trump said? You know, he bragged he won't seek Trump's endorsement, so I didn't give it, which guaranteed his loss. Here's an article from NBC News. And this was written, let me find the date on this, March 29th, a few days before the election. In Wisconsin Supreme Court race, conservative Daniel Kelly keeps distance from Trump. Here's verification of the exact same thing that Trump was mentioning. In an interview with NBC News, Kelly said he was not looking for an endorsement from Trump, which lent him his support in Kelly's unsuccessful 2020 state Supreme Court race. We read in this article written by Adam Edelman, Daniel Kelly, the conservative candidate in the race that will determine ideological control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, said he isn't looking for an endorsement from former President Donald Trump in the final days of the campaign. And if Trump were to issue one anyway, Kelly's campaign wouldn't necessarily welcome it. Quote, "We're not looking for one," Kelly said in an interview Wednesday, responding to a question about whether there was a last-minute Trump endorsement in the works. "I'm not really looking for endorsements from political actors." Probably better to say you're not looking for an endorsement from Trump, but you're just trying to be polite. I digress. Asked if he would welcome an endorsement from Trump, Kelly responded, "We'd have to take a look at it and see what message that would be sending." Huh? What message it would be sending? It would be sending, Kelly, you dingbat, you might be a brilliant jurist, but you're crap for a politician. The message that it sends is to the Trump base to say, hey, this is my guy, come out and vote. No wonder this guy got his rear end spanked. But anyway, going back to the article, it's moments like that that just, yeah. He also said he had no idea about whether an endorsement would hurt his campaign. Well, the absence of it sure didn't help you. Kelly, a former Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, lost his seat in 2020 to liberal Jill Karofsky, a race in which he was endorsed by Trump. Okay, you could maybe make an argument that, you know, having been there, done that, Kelly was like, I don't know if I want this endorsement or not. Now, what difference did the absence of that endorsement make? Here's something for you to think about. Let's go back to the numbers on that race between Prasewicz and Kelly. The total number of voters in that race was 1.8 million. Now, if you're wondering what that compares to, go back less than a year, frankly, to the Wisconsin Senate race. They had 2.6 million. That's a difference of 800,000 voters. Now, I'm not saying all 800,000 voters would have come out and voted for Daniel Kelly, but you can't tell me out of that missing vote that he could have gotten a lot more help. He lost this race by over 200,000 votes. Now, there's a lot of reasons for the loss, obviously, but one of them is downturn in the voting. People didn't come out to vote. I mean, say what you want to about Trump's endorsement, but that would have motivated the Trump base. Notice I didn't say regular Republicans. I said the Trump base to actually come out and support this guy. If Trump gives a full-throated endorsement, it most certainly would have helped Kelly. But he didn't want it. So to quote one of my favorite old journalists, the late David Brinkley, what are we to make of all this? Well, for Chicago, unfortunately, it's going to be more of the same. More progressive politics, more crime, higher taxes, fewer police officers, and the slow, steady drain of population and businesses leaving what was once a great metropolis in the Midwest. For Wisconsin, there's going to be short and long-term implications, and those short-term implications could have a profound effect on the 2024 presidential election. As a matter of fact, there are some people that are saying that Wisconsin may be lost to the Republicans before a vote is ever cast in the November election. Possible. I think that may be a little premature. Let's wait and see how all this plays out. There's 1,000,001 factors that affect how people are going to vote in a presidential election. We're not even there yet. It's an eternity before we get there. So let's see how this plays out. But for the sake of fairness, yeah, this doesn't help Republicans if they're trying to win a statewide race for the presidency in the Badger State. I will give you some reactions. I almost neglected to do that, particularly as it relates to Wisconsin. There's one thing I do want to show you. This is from the attorney Robert Barnes. If you're not following him on Twitter or his locals page, do so. This guy is one sharp cat. Give me just a second. I want to pull this up because this is really good. And it talks about Daniel Kelly's loss in Wisconsin. Barnes writes, Kelly decided to run a Bush-Ryan-Romney-style campaign, refused any Trump support, as we've mentioned, ignored populist issues, and ran as a champion of corporate Wisconsin cops and prosecutors. He got crushed. When will Republicans learn? You know, every point he makes in there is valid. Wisconsin isn't necessarily a establishment Republican state. I mean, this is a state with a long history in labor union movement, populism, everything else. So for Daniel Kelly to just run as some kind of like, Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney, clone, that's not going to cut it. The reason that Trump won and the reason that Ron Johnson won is because Johnson tagged like Trump. Populists caring about, more grassroots fundamental issues, more populist issues, pocketbook issues. They were able to pull off successful statewide campaigns in Wisconsin. If Kelly, or if Republicans like him keep trying to do this in Wisconsin, they're going to keep losing. A couple other reactions. And this kind of speaks to frustration inside the base about the leadership of the GOP. This is Robbie Starbuck, very strong activist out of the state of Tennessee. Democrats did everything they could to flip the Wisconsin Supreme Court. National GOP did not. Whatever they're doing just isn't cutting it. There was a critical race to win for election integrity. I saw more work from Scott Pressler, young man who's out there getting people registered to vote, just a good guy, than I did from national GOP apparatus. And then finally, Brigitte Gabriel. George Soros now owns the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Not a good sign heading into 2024. What is Rona Romney doing? She has to go. Well, a little too late for that. You had a chance to get rid of her as national chairwoman, and she's still there. So what are we to make of all this? You get the government you vote for. But in this case, I don't think both of these elections were really decided by that in one sense. I think this is more a case of you get the government you don't vote for. Now, here's where I'm going to get a little bit of case of crankiness. 3.6 million people in Chicago, 550,000 votes. 15% of the population of Chicago voted in their mayoral election. At a time when that city is absolutely slowly going down the toilet, only 15% of the people in the city of Chicago cared enough to get out and vote. That city is riddled with crime. It's losing population. It's losing businesses. It's not safe. You have a mayor's office in complete disarray, Lori Lightfoot, and only 550,000 people bothered to come out and vote. I'm sorry, Democrat, Republican, Independent, I don't care what you are in Chicago. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. You really should. You didn't care enough to go out and vote to try to save your city. And look, I love you. Every person in Chicago, I love you. I really do. But for the next 4 years, whatever you get, you've earned. Either by proactively voting for more of the same, or by not even being willing to get off your butt and try and do something about it. In Wisconsin, I got a bone to pick with Republicans, and I got a bone to pick with Trump voters, who I don't classify them as normal Republicans. See, Trump voters only come out if Trump's on the ballot or if Trump gives a ringing endorsement or he's doing rallies or whatever. I'm sorry. For those of you who have re-engaged in the political process, I understand your frustration. Given the way the National Republican Party has treated you over the course of 30 years, I can understand why you don't want to engage again. But I will point out something. There's coming a day when Donald Trump's not going to be on the ballot. He's not going to be around politically. What are you going to do then? Are you just going to wash your hands of it and walk away and let whatever happens happen? Let the country continue to slide? Or are you going to re-engage and do something about it? If you're going to re-engage, it's elections like this one for the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin where you really could have been used. Your help could have been needed and really appreciated, by the way. And for all you regular establishment country clubbers out there in Wisconsin, you regular GOP voters at the cocktail parties and whatever, where were you? This race had national implications, and you guys couldn't be bothered to come out and vote. Now, for those of you who did, and even if you voted for the Democrat, I at least respect that. You got out and voted. But for the regular GOP in Wisconsin, for the Trump voters in Wisconsin, this one is on you. Not necessarily for what you did in your vote, but for what you didn't do by not voting. As we start to wrap this up, do me some favors as always. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. Let's make sure you're always aware when we're putting a new video up. Share it around to friends. Hit the like button. My name is Brian Trippett. I'm your Front Porch Conservative, and I'll see you next time.